So Walt was, walking along the hallway up to his room and must have made a take like you can't believe it. When he saw this guy, God, he did a take. And went up to his office, I guess, and he said, what's that Negro doing around here? Oh, no, well, he's not a Negro. He's a Hindu. We said, well, he's pretty dark. Get rid of him.
Walt Disney built a global empire selling innocence, magic, and dreams. But underneath that glossy image lies a history the company would rather you ignore. For decades, Disney pushed out films and attractions soaked in racist imagery, from blackface cartoons to sugar-coated portrayals of plantation life. The sad part is, these weren't accidents. They were deliberate choices that reflected and reinforced the prejudices of their time. And while Disney now parades its diversity efforts, it still hasn't fully owned up to the harm it caused. This documentary digs into the secrets they've tried to bury, the ones that shaped generations without ever being questioned. It's time to confront the truth. Because behind all the pixie dust, there's a darker story Disney never wanted you to notice. And if you believe stories like this deserve to be heard, consider subscribing to the channel. We'd be grateful for your support. Let's dive into it. Disney's earliest cartoons of the late 1920s and 1930s often drew directly from vaudeville and minstrel shows, popular entertainment forms built on grotesque blackface caricatures. Mickey Mouse himself first appeared in Steamboat Willie in 1928, but soon took on traits of the minstrel Zip Coon figure, with a round black body, big white eyes, and by 1929, white gloves on his hands. Those gloves, as animation historian John Canemaker explains, originally solved a technical problem by making Mickey's hands visible against his dark body, but they also carried visual links to minstrel performers who wore the same kind of gloves on stage. In one early Mickey short titled The Opry House from 1929, Mickey performs on a vaudeville stage in a way that modern viewers interpret as a clear nod to minstrelsy. Animation scholar Nicholas Salmon stated without hesitation that Mickey Mouse isn't like a minstrel, he is a minstrel, emphasizing that the character was created through a lens shaped by racist traditions. The influence became more obvious in later shorts. In Mickey's Melodrammer from 1933, Mickey and his friends staged their own version of Uncle Tom's Cabin. Mickey, Minnie, Goofy, and Clarabelle Cow appear in full blackface. They cover their faces in soot, apply exaggerated lips, and wear cotton whiskers to impersonate enslaved plantation characters. A newspaper at the time described the cartoon as good material, which speaks to how accepted and praised these images were among white audiences. No major pushback followed the cartoon's release. Likewise, Santa's Workshop, released in 1932 as part of the Silly Symphony series, featured a black doll designed as a pickaninny with oversized lips and a shuffling walk. Disney later removed that doll from re-released versions of the short following international criticism. Even scenes built for holiday cheer were not free from racial caricature. In cartoons like these, black characters and images were often used as background jokes. These weren't characters with stories or voices. They were set pieces. A clown doll with dark skin appears and disappears. A monkey-like figure in blackface plays a ragtime tune. Minnie and Mickey appear wearing makeup to resemble minstrel performers while entertaining animals. These inclusions were not isolated. A study found that by the 1930s, Disney had released several shorts that leaned heavily on minstrel show tropes, and the trend did not slow down. These were baked into the studio's early DNA. This meant Disney's foundations were not just shaped by outdated humor. They were built directly on the aesthetics of racial mockery. While fans still treasure Mickey and his world, it is important to acknowledge what the character looked like when he first stepped onto the screen. These cartoons did not exist in a vacuum. They reflected social norms in white America, and Disney used those norms without hesitation. One modern review put it clearly: Mickey may not have acted dim-witted or slow, but his visual origin carried the same racial baggage as any blackface performer of the era. That wasn't accidental. That was Disney's starting point. As Disney shifted from short cartoons to full-length films, its habit of leaning on racist imagery didn't disappear. It simply evolved. The studio's move into cinematic storytelling during the 1940s and 1950s brought with it a new scale and polish, but many of the same old caricatures remained right beneath the surface. Instead of scrubbing away the minstrel show roots of its early years, Disney embedded those same ideas into the characters, songs, and stories of its most beloved classics. Dumbo, released in 1941, is often remembered for its message about believing in yourself. But that story is wrapped inside a presentation that relied heavily on racial caricature. When Dumbo tries to make sense of his strange ability to fly, he meets a group of crows who speak in heavy slang, move with exaggerated swagger, and perform a swing number that plays like a vaudeville act. The lead crow was named Jim in some promotional materials, which likely wasn't a coincidence. That name evokes the Jim Crow laws that enforced racial segregation in the United States. The Crow characters spoke in Southern black dialect, cracked jokes in broken English, and sang a song titled "When I See an Elephant Fly" with lyrics full of deliberately mangled grammar. Some defenders of the film have said that the crows are actually sympathetic to Dumbo, and that they help him realize his potential. That may be true within the plot, but it doesn't erase how they were drawn and voiced. These weren't just birds. They were black-faced jokes in animal form. Their musical number was a minstrel performance, and their animation leaned into stereotypes popularized by racist cartoons decades earlier. The foreman at the circus construction site is another example. He barks orders at faceless workers in a gravelly voice. His body is stocky, his lips are oversized, and his speech slurred and guttural. Animators gave him bulldog features and dark skin, turning him into a literal beast of burden, a visual joke rooted in dehumanization. In Fantasia, released in 1940, Disney inserted its most explicit black caricatures into a classical music showcase. The film's pastoral symphony sequence introduced audiences to a cast of centaurs, half human, half horse, frolicking in a mythological paradise. Most were elegant white figures, but two were not. Sunflower, a small black centaurette with huge lips and tightly coiled hair, served the white centaurettes by polishing their hooves and fetching flowers. Another centaurette, Attica, was larger and darker, drawn with donkey-like features rather than a sleek horse's body. These characters were clearly designed to resemble the pickaninny and mammy figures long used to mock black women in American media. Even Disney eventually acknowledged how offensive these portrayals were. By the late 1960s, as the civil rights movement reshaped public discourse, the studio quietly removed Sunflower and Attica from all future releases. They were erased from the film without explanation. Most children watching Fantasia today have no idea those characters ever existed. But the decision to delete them rather than address them shows how Disney chose silence over accountability. Rather than using its platform to admit the harm, it opted to rewrite the archive and pretend the problem never happened. In Peter Pan, released in 1953, the racism moved from black caricature to Native American stereotyping. The film's depiction of the Neverland tribe reduced indigenous people to a collection of degrading cliches. They were shown as wild, simple-minded, and overly theatrical. Their language was broken and stilted, their music was percussive and chaotic, their customs were mocked outright. The song "What Makes the Red Man Red" delivers this racism through lyrics that suggest Native people got their skin color from being embarrassed, a literal joke about pigmentation. Tiger Lily's father, the tribal chief, is portrayed as a bumbling figure who growls and dances in a comical, unflattering way. Tiger Lily herself is silent, fetishized, and positioned as a prize for Peter Pan. The portrayal was so over the top that it even exaggerated the racism of the original Peter Pan play, which had already been offensive in its own right. Disney didn't inherit this depiction passively. It expanded it, it made it sing and dance, it dressed it up with animation and music and pushed it out to millions of children. The result was that entire generations grew up learning a warped, mocking image of Native culture from a film intended to entertain. For decades, Peter Pan played on television and VHS without any warnings. Today, the version streaming on Disney Plus includes a disclaimer about offensive content. But for many indigenous families, the damage had long since been done. Disney's mid-century films didn't limit their offenses to Black and Native characters. The Aristocats, released in 1970, featured a cat named Shungan, who plays the piano with chopsticks and sings in a fake Asian accent. His buck teeth and slanted eyes followed a cartoon tradition of mocking East Asians that dated back to World War II propaganda. In Cinderella and Snow White, Black characters were simply absent. No side characters, no background villagers, no representation at all. The world was white by default, and in Swiss Family Robinson, Disney cast white actors as pirates in dark makeup and stereotypical Asian costumes, using face paint and fake accents to create the illusion of racial others. This was Disney's formula at the time: tell white-centric stories, add exotic or comedic characters for flavor, avoid serious engagement with race unless it's in the form of a joke. The result was a body of work that reinforced white supremacy by omission and distortion. Black children rarely saw themselves on screen, and when they did, it was through the lens of ridicule. Other non-white characters were treated as punchlines or plot devices. These messages weren't always loud, but they were clear, and they came wrapped in songs, sparkles, and childhood nostalgia. Disney has spent years celebrating this period as its golden age. But the truth is harder to swallow. These films were filled with subtle and overt racism, normalized through animation and storytelling that reached into every living room. The legacy of these classics isn't just about singing animals and fairy godmothers. It's also about who got left out, who got mocked, and who had to watch those stories without ever feeling seen. In 1946, Disney released what would become the most racially loaded film in its entire catalog. Song of the South combined live action and animation to bring Joel Chandler Harris's Uncle Remus stories to the big screen. The setting was a dreamlike version of the American South, sometime after the Civil War, but still echoing plantation life. The central characters included a white boy named Johnny and an older black man named Uncle Remus, who tells animal stories filled with life lessons. But what Disney called a charming tale, others recognized as something much more dangerous. From the beginning, there were warning signs. Clarence Muse, one of the first black actors in Hollywood, was hired early in the project to advise on the script. He left before production was complete. The final film erased any real depiction of the horrors of slavery or the social order that followed. It replaced them with smiling field workers, singing children, and a plantation that seemed free of cruelty. There was no mention of racial violence, no hint of black suffering, only cheerful songs and life lessons handed out on a porch by a quiet, gentle man. Uncle Remus, played by James Baskett, was shown as kind-hearted and wise, but also permanently cheerful and passive. He never pushed back against the white family that employed him. He never challenged the system that had placed him in that role. He existed to serve as a moral guide for a white child, not as a man with his own interior life. Aunt Tempe, the family's cook, filled the typical mammy mold. She was firm but lovable. She had no family of her own, no story outside the kitchen. These roles weren't neutral. They echoed the tropes that had long been used to minimize black people in American storytelling. Always loyal, always smiling, always grateful. Critics at the time immediately recognized the film's problems. The NAACP issued a statement noting that Song of the South gave the impression of an idyllic master-slave relationship, which is a distortion of the facts. Clarence Muse voiced his frustration in the press after seeing the final cut. He was angry that the studio had ignored his input and gone forward with a story soaked in nostalgia for a plantation fantasy that never existed. The phrase "old darky" was present in the original script, though some edits were made before release. Still, the tone remained the same. This was not a historical setting. This was a whitewashed reimagining of the South, designed to comfort white audiences. Despite the backlash, the film was celebrated by the industry. Zip-a-dee-doo-dah, the movie's signature song, won an Academy Award. Baskett received an honorary Oscar, the first ever given to a black actor in a leading role at Disney. These accolades didn't erase the harm. They only proved how far Hollywood was willing to go to reward a product that flattered the country's myths. Audiences could hum the tune, quote the stories, and laugh at Br'er Rabbit's antics without ever having to think about what was being left out. For decades, Disney kept the film alive through merchandise, TV specials, and theme park attractions, but it never saw a full home video release in the United States. In the 1980s, as racial tensions and cultural awareness sharpened, Disney quietly pulled the film from circulation. They never issued a formal apology. They never explained the decision in clear terms. They simply buried it. Song of the South became Disney's dirty secret, a film so tied to racism that even the company couldn't find a way to spin it as harmless nostalgia. The most visible trace of the film survived in Splash Mountain, a log flume ride that opened at Disneyland in 1989. The ride reused the animated segments from Song of the South, bringing Brer Rabbit, Brer Fox, and Brer Bear into a lively and colorful attraction. For years, few questioned it. The ride was catchy and thrilling, but by the 2010s, the associations became harder to ignore. People began asking why Disney would build a popular attraction around a film it refused to release. They began noticing the lyrics, the visuals, the music, and they realized the characters dancing and singing on Splash Mountain came from a film rooted in plantation nostalgia. In 2020, after nationwide protests and renewed conversations about race in America, Disney announced it would re-theme Splash Mountain. The new ride would be based on The Princess and the Frog, the studio's first film to feature a black princess as the lead. This shift was more than cosmetic. It was symbolic. A ride born from a film soaked in racial fantasy would be replaced by one that centered a black woman with ambition, struggle, and a story of her own. It was a move that admitted, in action if not in words, that the company had made a mistake. Still, the wound remains. Song of the South has never been formally addressed by Disney. It sits in the vault, untouched and unspoken, but its impact never vanished. For black audiences, the film wasn't just a story about rabbits and songs. It was a reminder that Disney once chose to romanticize a past filled with suffering, and tried to sell that vision to children as wholesome family entertainment. Disney's problem with race didn't stay locked in the animation vault. It made its way into the theme parks, where real people, real architecture, and real performances reinforced the same stereotypes already seen on screen. Disneyland wasn't just selling fantasy. It was selling nostalgia for a world where white comfort sat on top of black servitude. And nowhere was that more blatant than in one of its earliest eateries, Aunt Jemima's Pancake House. When Disneyland opened its gates in 1955, one of the first food attractions in Frontierland was a restaurant where visitors could eat pancakes served by a live Aunt Jemima. The building itself was dressed up to look like a southern plantation. Red brick walls, tall white columns, and a steamboat mural created a fantasy version of the Old South. Actors dressed in period clothing greeted guests, smiled warmly, and leaned into the role. In some early years, white women even wore dark makeup to play the character. Later, black actresses took over, often with scripted lines that reinforced the mammy stereotype. The entire space was crafted as a visit to the Old South, complete with fluffy biscuits, warm syrup, and a heavy dose of denial. For many white guests in the 1950s, this was just fun, a breakfast with a friendly face and a familiar bottle logo. For black visitors, it was something else entirely. It was a reminder that Disney had no problem romanticizing a period defined by slavery and brutality. It was a sign that the company saw no issue with turning a racist caricature into a smiling hostess. The fact that this restaurant existed at all shows how willing Disney was to lean into mythology. Not American history, just the version of history that made white people feel good. By the 1960s, this approach started to wear thin. The civil rights movement made it harder to ignore the implications. Activists and scholars called out the continued use of the Aunt Jemima character. Discussions about racial stereotypes reached the mainstream, and Disney quietly began to scale things back. By 1970, the character was removed. The restaurant was renamed River Belle Terrace. But even after the change, much of the original decor stayed. The plantation house look remained. The Southern theme lingered. The building still whispered that old story to anyone who knew how to hear it. For decades, Disney kept the film alive through merchandise, TV specials, and theme park attractions. But it never saw a full home video release in the United States. In the 1980s, as racial tensions and cultural awareness sharpened, Disney quietly pulled the film from circulation. They never issued a formal apology. They never explained the decision in clear terms. They simply buried it. Song of the South became Disney's dirty secret, a film so tied to racism that even the company couldn't find a way to spin it as harmless nostalgia. The most visible trace of the film survived in Splash Mountain, a log flume ride that opened at Disneyland in 1989. The ride reused the animated segments from Song of the South, bringing Brer Rabbit, Brer Fox, and Brer Bear into a lively and colorful attraction. For years, few questioned it. The ride was catchy and thrilling, but by the 2010s, the associations became harder to ignore. People began asking why Disney would build a popular attraction around a film it refused to release. They began noticing the lyrics, the visuals, the music, and they realized the characters dancing and singing on Splash Mountain came from a film rooted in plantation nostalgia. In 2020, after nationwide protests and renewed conversations about race in America, Disney announced it would re-theme Splash Mountain. The new ride would be based on The Princess and the Frog, the studio's first film to feature a black princess as the lead. This shift was more than cosmetic. It was symbolic. A ride born from a film soaked in racial fantasy would be replaced by one that centered a black woman with ambition, struggle, and a story of her own. It was a move that admitted, in action if not in words, that the company had made a mistake. Still, the wound remains. Song of the South has never been formally addressed by Disney. It sits in the vault, untouched and unspoken, but its impact never vanished. For Black audiences, the film wasn't just a story about rabbits and songs. It was a reminder that Disney once chose to romanticize a past filled with suffering, and tried to sell that vision to children as wholesome family entertainment. Disney's problem with race didn't stay locked in the animation vault. It made its way into the theme parks, where real people, real architecture, and real performances reinforced the same stereotypes already seen on screen. Disneyland wasn't just selling fantasy. It was selling nostalgia for a world where white comfort sat on top of black servitude. And nowhere was that more blatant than in one of its earliest eateries, Aunt Jemima's Pancake House. When Disneyland opened its gates in 1955, one of the first food attractions in Frontierland was a restaurant where visitors could eat pancakes served by a live Aunt Jemima. The building itself was dressed up to look like a southern plantation. Red brick walls, tall white columns, and a steamboat mural created a fantasy version of the Old South. Actors dressed in period clothing greeted guests, smiled warmly, and leaned into the role. In some early years, white women even wore dark makeup to play the character. Later, black actresses took over, often with scripted lines that reinforced the mammy stereotype. The entire space was crafted as a visit to the Old South, complete with fluffy biscuits, warm syrup, and a heavy dose of denial. For many white guests in the 1950s, this was just fun, a breakfast with a friendly face and a familiar bottle logo. For black visitors, it was something else entirely. It was a reminder that Disney had no problem romanticizing a period defined by slavery and brutality. It was a sign that the company saw no issue with turning a racist caricature into a smiling hostess. The fact that this restaurant existed at all shows how willing Disney was to lean into mythology. Not American history, just the version of history that made white people feel good. By the 1960s, this approach started to wear thin. The civil rights movement made it harder to ignore the implications. Activists and scholars called out the continued use of the Aunt Jemima character. Discussions about racial stereotypes reached the mainstream, and Disney quietly began to scale things back. By 1970, the character was removed. The restaurant was renamed River Belle Terrace. But even after the change, much of the original decor stayed. The plantation house look remained. The Southern theme lingered. The building still whispered that old story to anyone who knew how to hear it. To this day, most guests pass through the River Belle Terrace unaware of its origin. But for those who do know, the space feels heavy. It feels like a forgotten monument to a version of Disneyland built with no concern for how black visitors might feel. The fact that Disney never issued a formal statement about the restaurant, never explained or addressed it, makes it worse. The company just erased the character, changed the name, and moved on. But memories like that don't disappear. They hang in the air. The Jungle Cruise, another original attraction from 1955, had a different kind of problem. One rooted in colonialism. The ride was designed as a humorous riverboat tour through regions of the so-called uncivilized world. Each scene was filled with animatronic animals and staged encounters. But it didn't take long for the jokes to turn ugly. Over the years, the ride featured a group of natives waving spears, dancing wildly, or preparing human stew in giant pots. These depictions were broad and lazy. They reduced entire continents to jungle savages. One recurring character, Trader Sam, was a supposed headhunter who stood grinning at the end of the ride with shrunken heads for sale. His costume included straw, beads, and exaggerated facial features. He wasn't a character, he was a punchline. Guests laughed because they were trained to see non-white cultures as silly or threatening. Jungle Cruise didn't just rely on colonial-era imagery. It glorified it. The explorers were white. The danger was always native, and Disney ran the joke for decades. In 2020, following nationwide protests and a broader reckoning with systemic racism, Disney finally addressed the issue. The company announced that the Jungle Cruise would be updated. Gone were the tribal ambushes and Trader Sam's offensive sales pitch. In their place came a new storyline about a diverse group of explorers who worked together to survive. The humor stayed, but the racism got cut. For Disney, this wasn't just an aesthetic shift. It was damage control. The park had run the old version for over 60 years. Pirates of the Caribbean had its own scene that drew criticism. For decades, the ride included an auction scene where women stood in line while pirates yelled and placed bids. One sign read, "Take a wench for a bride." Though most of the women were white, the tone was unmistakable. It evoked the visuals and rituals of slave auctions, dressed up in pirate garb and played for laughs. The scene stayed in place until 2017. When it was finally removed, Disney replaced it with a new vignette of female pirates leading a town raid. Again, no apology, just a quiet rewrite. In Florida's version of Jungle Cruise, there was an animatronic colonial figure who wore a white suit and waved a martini glass. He stood smugly in the middle of the chaos, another joke about explorers in foreign lands. That figure was eventually removed, too. One by one, these characters disappeared. Each edit marked a small shift, but none came with real explanation. Disney's pattern was clear. When the backlash got too loud, it adjusted. But it rarely talked about why. Across its parks, Disney built environments filled with comfort, cheer, and fantasy. But for many black visitors, those same spaces felt hollow. They told stories that left out the truth. They invited guests to laugh at images rooted in racism. And they made it clear who the magic was really for. Changing a ride or renaming a restaurant helps, but only if the company is willing to own what those spaces once said. Until then, the shadows linger, no matter how brightly the parks are lit. Disney is far from perfect, but in recent years the company has taken more visible steps to confront its past. On Disney Plus, older films flagged for offensive content now begin with a warning screen. As of 2020, Disney added a 15-second message that doesn't shy away from the truth. It tells viewers, "This program includes negative depictions and/or mistreatment of people or cultures. These stereotypes were wrong then and are wrong now. That language matters." Instead of vaguely noting that the material reflects outdated cultural depictions, Disney now admits that the portrayals were always harmful, not just by modern standards, but at the time they were made. This shift didn't happen by accident. It came after pressure from audiences, researchers, and advocates who demanded the company stop hiding behind nostalgia. To make these disclaimers more than empty gestures, Disney brought in an outside advisory council made up of scholars, artists, and cultural experts. Their role was to help shape how the company handled its historical material. The goal wasn't to erase films from the archive, but to place them in proper context. That approach marked a new phase in Disney's strategy. Instead of pretending the past never happened, the company began to reframe it with some measure of honesty. These changes weren't revolutionary, but they acknowledged something important, that storytelling has consequences, and those consequences need to be addressed directly. On the creative side, Disney has introduced more characters that expand its representation. The Princess and the Frog, released in 2009, gave the studio its first black princess. Tiana's story was set in the 1920s New Orleans and included black lead voices, a jazz-heavy score, and clear ties to Creole culture. Black audiences saw, for the first time, a Disney princess who looked like their daughters. That was a big step, but it wasn't without criticism. Tiana spends much of the film transformed into a frog. One parent pointed out that the girl isn't really there. She's a green frog most of the time. Others raised questions about Disney's decision to alter the voice performance to reduce dialect, or about how the film leaned into old class dynamics, with Tiana working constantly while the white best friend lived in a mansion. These critiques didn't mean the film wasn't meaningful. They showed how complicated progress can be. Tiana's story brought joy and representation, but it also carried traces of the same patterns black characters had always been placed into, transformed, sidelined, or framed through service. Still, it opened a door. Later films like Soul in 2020 and Encanto in 2021 built on that momentum, offering fuller portrayals of black and brown families and cultural life. Disney was beginning to listen, and the stories started to shift. On television, Disney Junior's Doc McStuffins became a major milestone. The series, which ran from 2012 to 2020, featured a young black girl who dreams of becoming a doctor. She fixes toys, runs her own clinic, and leads every episode. For many black families, Doc McStuffins wasn't just another show, it was a sign that things were changing. Still, the scarcity remained. One mother said her son watched The Princess and the Frog and noticed that Tiana was barely visible. Outside of Doc, most characters he saw were sidekicks or animal stand-ins. The numbers didn't lie. Even today, most lead characters across Disney's major properties remain white. The company says it wants to do better. In 2022, Black Panther star Letitia Wright directed a short film for Disney+, and several new projects created by black filmmakers are reportedly in development. Disney theme parks now host seasonal shows that honor black cultural figures, including Martin Luther King Jr. events at Animal Kingdom. These aren't solutions, but they're signals that the pressure is working. Audiences are demanding more than symbols. They want stories, roles, and recognition. Not just on screen, but behind the camera too. And they want the company to stop hiding from the truth. Disney built a kingdom of wonder, but it also built a legacy that many black audiences remember for the wrong reasons. The cartoons, the rides, the songs, they all carried messages that excluded, mocked, or erased. For decades, the company kept those parts hidden while celebrating the rest. Now Disney claims to be facing its past. It adds warnings, rewrites attractions, and uplifts new voices. Those changes matter, but they came late, and the memories remain. Mickey in blackface, Aunt Jemima in the park. Characters that taught black kids they weren't the story. Reckoning with that history isn't about guilt. It's about the truth. Because what children see shapes how they see themselves. Disney still has the power to inspire, but only if it tells the whole truth. The magic isn't lost when the truth is told. It's made stronger for everyone who finally sees themselves in the story. If this video opened your eyes to a side of Disney you were never shown, make sure to like it and hit that bell so you never miss what comes next. We uncover the truths they left out of the fairy tales, and there's more to tell. Subscribe to Black Culture Unlocked and keep digging with us. Drop a comment below. Did you grow up watching these films? What moments stuck with you or made you feel left out? Let's talk about it.